Hey guys, we're going to do a video on the lunar nodes today, and we'll include some material about Pluto and Saturn that typically don't get discussed because they're going to be discussed in the context of the nodes. The nodes are really interesting this far in the to mention this far in the series because they are a nice blend of some of the more mathematical, let's say, aspects of astrology that we talked about with the more philosophical and spiritual aspects that we've also discussed. Um, that's because the lunar nodes aren't actual physical bodies, they're mathematical points to begin with. And you'll see from the diagram in front of you an upside down horseshoe symbol and then a right side up horseshoe symbol. The upside down one is the south node and the right side up one is the north node. The moon moves on a plane going north to south across the ecliptic, which is, as we discussed in earlier videos, the ecliptic is the great circle that the Earth moves around the sun in, and but it appears as if, as you can see in this diagram, that the sun is moving in a kind of surround or like an IMAX movie screen against which the constellations appear in the sky. So, you'd have, say, the constellation of Libra back here behind the sun if it were Libra season, late September, early mid-October. And so the moon is touching this ecliptic at 2 points as it ascends, which is the north node, and as it descends, it touches it again, and that's the south node. You can see through this very simple diagram too, where we get eclipses from, and because eclipses are just very powerful new moons and full moons, and wherever the nodes are is where we have eclipses. So right now the north node is in Gemini and the south node is in Sagittarius. So we've been having eclipses in Gemini and Sagittarius season, which is late May, early mid-June, and late November, early December, respectively. That's Gemini and Sagittarius season. That's when the sun is in Gemini and Sagittarius, I should say, because obviously if we're talking about new and full moons, where the sun is in its constellation, that it is backdropping against, let's say, is also a crucial factor in the timing of eclipses. Obviously, the nodes don't move as fast as the sun does. They spend about 18 months per sign. So the north node, its backdrop, let's say, of the north node, that's going to be in Gemini for 18 months. It's been there since about last spring. So I think the last month that it is going to be in Gemini will be in December, and then in January 2022 it'll move into a Taurus. Last time that the north node was in Gemini would have been roughly 18 years ago. So that would have been shortly after 9/11. So it's very interesting to have that echo of history. I got a little ahead of myself in the other video on how to read a chart. The nodes take 18 years to circle a chart. I said it's 36. I mean, the node, wherever it is by your birth, will return to that place every 36 years, but it'll do it once before that when you're 18. So yeah, the nodes travel signs every 18 years, and your first nodal return is at 18, and your second's at 36. And in between, every 9 years, you have a counter nodal return where That's very interesting because the transiting north node will be on your birth south node. That's usually when things kind of go awry, I would say. And we'll talk more about that when we return to Saturn at the end of the video. Let's make a note about that here so that we make sure to mention that later on. So yeah, the first time when the node returns to your birth position when you're 18, it's the coming of age story. And then when you're 36, you've gone through another cycle of life, and typically people live to 36 years of age in the past. So and many other systems, and not just astrology, we talked about the importance of the number 36 in past videos. That's where you're kind of like, okay, I've seen it, I've done it, I keep encountering these same patterns in people, I'm kind of over it. So when you have your second nodal return at 36, it's not as, it's still very impactful. It's just not the freshness of the first nodal return when you're 18 and you kind of come into your own for the first time and become an adult. That's kind of why 18 is a very important age in our culture. 36 is like, oh, okay, I see my habits, I see my patterns, I see the type of people I attract, and I'm ready to break out of this karma, because that's what these nodes are, is that they are they're patterns, not only within your own local community, but within the human family, because we're talking about the moon here, and the moon is our personal family, our local family, but it's also the human family. So the south node, while it indicates, and you can even see this in terms of south, you think of the North Star, it's a point you're aiming for. South is past, sometimes referred to as the dragon's tail in some esoteric circles. It's the past, it's stagnant patterns, it's our default state, things that hold us back, that, well, they're gifts, we're very good at them. We have great facility with that area, but it kind of stereotypes us. And so it's an old role of ours within the human family. And you can think of it in terms of, if you believe in reincarnation, or just if you want to look at it strictly more from a cognitive development standpoint, it's just your past self, or a very young self. And the North Node represents a new role, a more liberating free will role that you can play within your local family and within your human family. So you can say your South Node, wherever it is, represents maybe your soul family, the kind of people and environments that you've habitually been around over various lifetimes. Before I go into the difference of nodes by sign and house, let's take a look at a different diagram here. Just to let this idea for you gel. It's a little bit, we'll say this is a little bit more of a technical diagram compared to the more aesthetic other one. And this shows you how the ascending node and the descending node, or the north and south node respectively, intersect with the ecliptic, and they get in the path of the sun's light as seen from the earth. And that, that plays into how you time the eclipses and how you get full moons and new moons, which is just what eclipses are. They're just mega versions of that. So here's the difference between the nodes by sign and house. Because they are, we'll go back here to this other diagram now that we talk about this other part. Because they are an axis, they're always opposite each other. You can't really isolate them. And we talked about in a previous video how there's not really 12 signs, there's more like 6 axes. There's not 12 houses, there's more like 6 axes. And so you'll share the nodes by sign with people born around your age, since they spend 18 months in each sign. Like I said, we've had Gemini since about May last year, and that the North Node has been in Gemini since May of last year, and by consequence, the South Node has been in Sagittarius at that time. And they'll both exit into new signs after this December. They move backwards through the zodiac. So I know Cancer follows Gemini, and I know Capricorn follows Sagittarius, but they move backwards. So when they change signs this upcoming January, the North Node is actually going to go into Taurus, which is the preceding sign of Gemini. And the South Node is going to go into Scorpio, which is the preceding sign of Sagittarius. So yeah, I mean, that's why people who are born on about a year and a half the other side of you, you just kind of get them, because you both come from a similar soul family in that regard, and you both have a similar, in terms of sign quality, a similar impetus or challenge to develop into a new role. In terms of outward quality, remember, the sign is the decor. It's the overt, almost the material decor of a particular area. What's going to be different for you due to birth time and location is the house that the nodes fall in, and even any aspect made to those nodes. I know that the slower planets may mean that, because those bigger, slower planets do move so slow, someone born a couple months from you might still have a Pluto, say, an aspect to the nodes. But those fast-moving planets like the Sun, Moon, Mercury, if they're making aspects to your nodes around your birthday, there could be someone born next month and they wouldn't have, or a couple weeks later, and we're going to, with regard to the moon itself, a couple of days later, and it wouldn't have those same aspects. So you do, in terms of your nodal challenges and your karma, let's say, you're very uniquely situated in that sense. So let us now flip to the lovely diagram that we had here the other day that we were looking at, of the basic template from which all birth charts are derived. So yeah, that's where the South Node is now in Sagittarius. That's where the North Node is in Gemini. They're moving backwards. So January 2022, it'll move into degree 29 of Taurus. The North Node will. And the South Node will move into degree 29 of Scorpio. And so let's say you have, by birth, the North Node in Gemini and the South Node in Sagittarius. Well, what's the quality of Sagittarius that would be so default for you and people born roughly on a couple months either side of you, that would indicate a state where you're held back in life, and where it's such a status quo, it's such a default state for you that it becomes a limiting perspective almost. It becomes almost like a stereotype. Well, Sagittarius, it is such a knowledge-driven sign, especially if you've read my manifesto part 1, you understand that it's driven to see the big picture. That can make you a bit of a fundamentalist, even a bit of an ideologue or a know-it-all. Whereas the Gemini North Node makes it difficult for you to see not so much the forest, but the individual trees and the individual perspectives which make up universal truth. Some of the more of the street smarts versus the book smarts, let's say. And so a lot of your cohort may be very righteous, very self-righteous, and have a real calling to mature into a state where they see that truth isn't so black and white. But you could have that in any house. So if it's the 5th house where that Gemini North Node is, you are going to have to, and remember we talked very much about the 5th house last time in our previous video, and Leo, and the Sun is another leg of that trinity. You're really going to have to get on stage with that ability to ask critical questions and see the shadings and the gradients between black and white. And another way you can find out how you can do that is because Mercury rules Gemini things and he rules that Gemini North Node, you go and find where Mercury is in your chart and find any aspects related to him. For example, the Mercury may be in your 1st house. And so if you had Gemini in the 5th house, let's see, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Yeah, you might have like Aquarius rising. So if the ruler of your Gemini North Node 5 was in Aquarius 1, you would probably be a public speaker, because again we come back to what does 1 mean? It's that Aries. It's another fire house. It's a very outwardly expressing zone of the zodiac. And so you might teach people how to be a very confident questioner of dogma. With regard to the South Node, Sagittarius, in this example, South Node Sagittarius would be ruled by Jupiter. So you would need to go find where Jupiter is in your chart, and say, for example, you have a Jupiter in the 4th house. Maybe it's a sense of, since the 4th house deals with our inner home and our physical home and our ancestral roots, maybe you grew up around a lot of dogmatists and your family and your relatives were very staunch liberals or very staunch conservatives, and you've cultivated that mentality even at an emotional level, and that's how you find security. And that it would explain why and how that status quo gets manifested, is that you continually get sucked into these environments where you're around your family and relatives a lot and calling out other people in a very black and white way. So the nodes are very interesting. And you can see there's so much nuance, even in just this example, having that North Node in Aquarius. Aquarius is such like a polymath. You see how it supports that impetus, that challenge to see many sides of the story. So again, astrology is very fractal, and it finds ways to support the story or the themes encoded in your chart. That's all triangulation does, really. It's just like a Carfax. You kind of see the chain of command and where the energy is coming from in your chart. Nodes are constantly moving, like all the other planets that are constantly moving around the zodiac. What happens, and other planets are interacting with them because those planets are moving as well. What's very interesting is that planets might interact with them, and one of the ways in which the common way in which they interact with them is called at the bendings. Last time we talked about things being a 90-degree angle to each other and what that means. Well, because the nodes are obviously a 180-degree axis at all times, anytime, whenever something at a 90-degree angle, in this case it would be Pisces or Virgo, since we're talking about the Gemini-Sag axis, that's going to be in a 90-degree angle to both. That creates what we call a T-square in astrology. When there's three planets involved, a 180-degree axis, and then a third point like a referee in a tennis match, impacting them and pressurizing both ends of that axle or that axis. what happens, because these are mathematical points, these are nodes indicating both individual and a collective timeline, because there are nodes transiting all the time. It's not just where they're stamped in your birth chart. When it pressurizes those, if it's a fast-moving planet like the sun, it might just be like a quick generational changing event. But right now we actually have a very slow-moving planet, Neptune, in his home sign of Pisces, that is at the bendings with these nodes. And it's been in effect for a long time. Neptune is such a bendy, dreamy planet, and to have him smashing those nodes for so long and being such a slow-moving, powerful planet, he's really warped our sense of time. And over the past year or so, we've completely lost sense of days and weeks and months. It's just become this endless melt into a new world. And so we're having a very unique experience of that at the bendings right now. And that's a great example of how transiting planets and the transiting nodes can interact with each other and create very distinct flavors of the zeitgeist. Some of those transiting nodes, they may touch personal planets. So a lot of people born in early June, the transiting North Node is coming on their sun, and that's giving them a lot of opportunities to vitally shine in a way that leads the collective to a point of questioning these kind of black and white dogmatic positions. So it's very interesting to see how those layers get implicated and not only tell collective headline stories, but draw you in to the collective zeitgeist as well. And I think that's how the news business is run, is that people have their nodes or certain planets are impacted by the transiting nodes, and they get sucked into these bigger stories. I'm sure, like Vlad, for example, at Robinhood, he had something like that happening with his chart or with the company's chart, that he became an integral player in that play, or integral character in that play. Now here's where we can get a little bit more nuanced, and we can start talking more about these spiritual concepts like karma. Pluto was discovered in 1930, and he's come to symbolize in astrology a kind of bottomless pit, a kind of endless peeling back of onion layers until the soul is so purified that it realizes that it inhabits a kind of lush emptiness. And we saw there's always higher and lower octave manifestations of these planetary energies, as we discussed in our first video. And obviously, when it was discovered at the time of probably its lowest octave expression of that modality I just described, of peeling back every layer until you reach the void, because that's when we had the Holocaust and World War II and the rise of Nazism. Pluto in its lowest octave is considered just absolute destruction and control, and its higher octave is absolute, we'll say, phoenix energy, and so it is considered the planet of reincarnation. Well, if it is the planet of reincarnation, and we talked about how the South Node indicates where our soul grouping, our soul tribe is, not only by sign, but where it falls in terms of house. Understanding that connection, a guy named Jeff Green developed a system of astrology called Evolutionary Astrology from the perspective of Pluto. And he realized that Pluto, whatever sign and house it fell in, um, represented a kind of emotional trauma, a lack resulting from the spiritual and material environment which one inhabited. And because of that trauma, and because of that ever-present lack, it created an unmet emotional need, a kind of persistent itch, which I can definitely see that. That's a very scorpionic, that's a very Plutonian thing. But because it's impossible to meet that need, because it's predicated a priori on an experience of trauma and lack, you can't scratch that itch. And what happens is it creates an obsessive compulsive condition in the individual to keep going back to the well in that particular sign and house to try to meet that unmet need in ever more, let's say, unhinged ways if it gets too out of control. But it doesn't sate the desire, and it almost becomes a real drag on your free will, because it gains this almost Holocaust-like momentum where you just get drawn further and further into the compulsion and the obsessiveness and the jealousy and the lust to have this need sated. And so it's a heavy duty planet. Jeff Green thought that the South Node, wherever it showed up by sign and house, that was the scene that you would run to as a kind of unconscious sleight of hand to tell yourself, I'm not going back to the well. I'm not trying to scratch this impossible itch. I'm just doing the things that I'm destined to do. I'm just doing the things that I'm gifted with. And the individual gets kind of stuck in this loop or this whirlpool of karma, because that's the South Node is. It's a holding pattern. And he thought that holding pattern was running on, because Pluto is such a background unconscious energy, deals with like undercover cops, for instance. That's the gears that are pushing you into that state of affairs, constantly getting stuck in that holding pattern, because it's running on this repressed emotional trauma and lack. So he came to see the Pluto polarity point as tied to an axis with the birth Pluto, much like the North Node is the liberation point tied to the axis of the South Node. He thought it was a way out of the karmic loop and a way to evolve, right? Evolutionary astrology, a way to evolve into free will and liberation. Because he like other seers and mystics, he wanted people to overcome their karma, because karma, and now we're starting to get into Saturn, and we'll bring him up in a bit. Karma is merely cause and effect. You do something, it puts like I roll a ball on the ground and it's rolling towards my front door right now. That's because I put it in motion. I put it on the ground and I patted it towards the door. That's kind of what karma is. And especially if you have this repressed emotional need that keeps you going back to a certain scene and a certain set of behaviors and gifts, you just keep rolling that ball towards the front door again over and over, and the momentum builds and it gets you stuck in these cause and effect loops. And it's like plutonium, it's radioactive. It takes a long time for that half-life to wear out, for you to say, I'm going to stop being, for example, in this example we're running with, I'm going to stop being that dogmatic ideologue. I'm going to stop just nodding silently when I'm at my family's dinner table and they're saying like, oh, those Democrats are demon rats and those conservatives are faux conservatives or whatever. The individual saying, I'm going to get out of that loop. I'm going to go towards my North Node in Gemini and see the shades and the gradients of truth. Well, Jeff Green is saying another way to do that is to go towards your Pluto polarity point. So let's layer on this example. If the individual's Pluto was in Libra, Libra is about partnerships, so it creates a really compulsive. There's something that happened in that individual's life that makes them extremely codependent. That's where the trauma and the lack is from. So they may feel that they're going to be ostracized and estranged and unloved and unseen if they don't sit there, nod silently, and adopt the dogmatic paradigm that is encoded by their South Node gifts and where the South Node ruler is. Because again, it is a gift that you could be, that dogma can make you an amazing political analyst, and probably a lot of these Twitter talking heads that you see out there have something like that, but you can see that the troubles it causes their lives, and that's probably a South Node or even a Plutonian effect. So yeah, in this example, you have Pluto and Libra, and that's the emotional state making you go back to that well. And so you run to that South Node in Sagittarius, and where the ruler is in the fourth house, and you say, oh, I need to be needed. I need to be seen as smart. I need to be seen as the God that shows up and parses and analyzes the political paradigm. And so, yeah, of course, I'm just going to sit and nod my head when I come into these dogmatic conversations with my family. Well, the Pluto polarity point would be in Aries, which is, we've talked about, is the first house and is kind of a take no prisoners, go out on your own, guns blazing kind of house, as you'll remember from previous discussions. That would liberate the individual, much like the North Node in Gemini seeing shades and gradients. That would say, you know what, I don't need to be codependent. I don't need to have your validation in order to be someone in the world, in order to validate what I'm about to say, in order to be seen as correct or smart. In the context of this example, I'm going to say what I feel is going to help best move me forward in an Aries way, which is a very first house way. And how very interesting, I didn't even think about this when I was laying out the example earlier. We said that the ruler in our example of the North Node in Gemini would have been in their first house of Aquarius. So again, you see how it's all fractal. You see how these themes I'm actually riffing on a person's chart I know of, so that's kind of interesting. I'm kind of seeing those layers now. You see how they're fractal, and how the North Node and the Pluto polarity point are very supportive of each other in this example. If you're a millennial out there, you've got your Pluto and Scorpio, and if you're a Zoomer born after 95 to 2007, into 2007, you've got your Pluto and Sagittarius. And so the unmet emotional needs and the sense of lack and trauma for those Scorpio, boy, well, Pluto rules Scorpio, so Scorpio is very much like Pluto. We talked about how they deal with situations of control and power, and there's a real lust for power among millennials. It's kind of the need to be the viral YouTube sensation, and that drives a lot of their karma. Sagittarius Pluto for the Zoomers is a real draw towards wisdom and gurudom and feeling like there's more to reality, because Sagittarius is the great adventure. Well, the solution for those two generations is the Pluto polarity point in Taurus for Scorpio is that you can be calm in and of yourself without any outward external accolades and be supremely rich still. For Gemini, for those Zoomers who have Pluto and Sagittarius, it's more of calming their voraciousness in terms of knowledge and having to know it all and to be it all, and to say, you know what, this afternoon was just really beautiful. We went down to the river and had a nice chat about the weather and some people's dogs that came up. Just seeing a very very like shaded gradient experience of life and not having to have this totalized comprehensive experience of life. Um, so Pluto is very interesting in how it sets up your karma. Um, let's talk about cycles now, and we'll close out with this. I said that cause and effect is the basic mechanism of karma. And there's no planet more cause and effect than Saturn. He's part of the trinity of Capricorn and 10. Saturn is truly the most cause and effect planet, so he gets drawn in here as well. I talked about when you're 18, say you're born with Gemini North Node, and then when you're 18, the Gemini North Node comes back here. But then when 9-ish years later, when you're about 27, that it'll be flipped, and then the South Node will be touching your South Node, the transiting South Node, will be touching your birth North Node. And the transiting North Node will be touching your birth South Node. That's called a counter nodal return, and that's when things kind of go awry. 27, now that's a very interesting age because that's about the time when Saturn, the ruler of Capricorn and all 10th house matters, returns to our birth position. So let's just say you have Saturn in Libra. At that 27th year, when you're having that counter nodal return, Saturn is nearing its first return in your birth chart. Saturn is, like Pluto, tied to these nodal cycles, and things are going awry in terms of a karmic situation in order to set up the scene for your Saturn return in Libra in this example, because the Saturn return demands that we strap up and achieve a sense of personal mastery and responsibility by saying, because again, Saturn refers to all these 10th house Capricorn things, these high points in our chart, to say, this is who I am in the world. This is how I'm going to be an adult. This is how I see my personal story in some way congruent or not congruent with the mainstream narrative. And so the late 20s are always this really hard time for a lot of us because we're grappling with a situation that is testing us. It's triggering us. What's interesting is that 9 years later, when you have your second nodal return, when the North Node transiting and the birth North Node are lining up again, what's happening is that Saturn is usually squaring its position that it just touched, your birth position. And so when you have your second nodal return, you're often having your Saturn square Saturn, and we talked about squares before. It's a real productive, it's still kind of grinding your gears, but it's less of a hazing process. It's kind of like, well, what did you learn when you had to rise up in your late 20s? Because the North and North Node touching are very supportive, unlike the flip situation. So it's a little bit less of a hazing process. It's like Saturn saying, what did you learn when I tried to teach you that hard lesson? Are you ready to use that hard lesson in order to go forward into a point of free will and liberation? Here's what's very interesting too, is that Pluto and Saturn have their own cycle as well, and they can join every 36 years. There's that number just keeps showing up again over and over. So amazing that was the average lifespan of Western man when this template was being developed. So they conjoined in about 83 in Libra last time, and they conjoined in 2020 this past year, 36 years later roughly, and they were both square each other. The point in Capricorn was square where they conjoined in Libra by degrees, because remember, it's 30 degrees per sign. I think that what that what that whole thing is about, because it's such a difficult scenario. 2020 was no cakewalk. 83, that was a rough, austere year as well. Just remember, these are heavy hitters. These are really rough planets. I think that that's teaching us, and I'll put a note in the video description. I did a very technical deconstruction of this idea in a newsletter. I think that that's what that's telling us about, because those are generational planets and they fuse every 36 years, and it's layered with all this other meanings and symbols of 36, is it tells us about a triple decker generational situation, because of the way that the cycles sync up, is that you have 18-year-olds looking at 36-year-olds who are looking at early mid-50s guys who are all having nodal experiences, critical nodal experiences, as we've been saying, like the returns and the counter nodal returns at the same time. I think that's very interesting, because when we look at those ages, those three ages, that's a bit like, well, the 18-year-old would be the fire kind of. They're just out there roaring with their hormones and kind of providing the fresh energy. The 36-year-old is kind of a master of his passions now, and he's kind of like the older brother. And then you have the elder statesman, the mid early 50s guy who's retired and kind of presiding over matters quietly. So for example, people born in 83 with their North Node in Gemini, they came of age in 2001, right around 9/11. That's when they turned 18, and that's when they had their first nodal return. They just had their nodal return, and they were born, by the way, when Saturn and Pluto were conjoined in Libra in 83. They just had their second nodal return around age 36 last year, when again, lucky them, Saturn and Pluto were conjoined again in Capricorn. People who were born roughly in the aftermath of 9/11 were having their first nodal return in 2020. And so it was very interesting. You saw like a lot of elder millennials looking back on how they came of age at 9/11, and now there's a new generation behind them who are the age that they were at 9/11, and who are these Zoomers are kind of, the elder millennials are looking at them because they're the seed. They're carrying forth that energy because they were born around that time, and through their facility with digital spaces and their zany sense of humor and their real exuberance and love for life, because remember, they've got their Pluto and Sagittarius. They're helping the elder millennials see what their journey from 18 to 36 has been about, and that stacks also with, I guess, the Gen Xers, because the Gen Xers would have been about 36 when 9/11 happened. And so now they're looking at the elder millennials who are 36 now in the wake of 2020, kind of another traumatic 9/11 event, especially because we're talking about these Pluto cycles coming in, and they're saying, oh, that's who I was back at 9/11. And how interesting how far they've come, these elder millennials who are now, I'd say like their role is kind of like, they're maybe a little more skeptical of what the digital domain can do. You don't want to get too calcified in that and too cynical, and that's how those elder millennials look to the Zoomers and see what they're doing in the digital space and still feeling inspired by them. So yeah, it creates these cycles of 9 and 18 and 36, create these stacked generational cycles, I think that's where we get culture from. That's where we get the zeitgeist from. That's where we get these ideas of generations from. So if you want to see that argument laid out in terms of like a more linear argument, scaffolded in how all the math lines up, and how I see that maybe leading to a new renaissance now, similar to the renaissance that occurred musically after 9/11, and how that's going to transpire between how Zoomers and elder millennials see each other, and how elder millennials and Gen Xers see each other. I'll put the the issue number of that back issue of my newsletter out there in tweets and in the video description. You can go read that. There is some dark side to this because, again, we are talking about Pluto. It's very dark. There's a lot of competition in the workplace between these three generations, and a lot of them see work also as a way to get mates, the opposite sex. And it creates a very tense, very unfortunate state of affairs in which not only are all the males competing against each other for a limited number of jobs rather than cooperatively working together around this very complex situation, which they normally would do. They're kind of like fighting each other over these jobs because of limited resources. We'll say like a manufactured scarcity as well, if you've read the Patchwork Manifesto. And then they're also fighting with their prospective mates because of how we've dropped the ball in terms of not really bringing the gender relations up to speed with the workplace paradigm. And so the men and women who would typically be dating or making families, they're fighting over jobs too, and why they do that, whether it's resources or for status, or if they're millennial and they've got that Pluto and Scorpios because they have that trauma around needing to feel and be seen as powerful. It's a really nuts situation that we've got our hands on now, and that's, I hope, through the manifesto and through my Twitter and through the newsletter issue that I'm going to point you to, and several of the other newsletter issues, that we can use this ancient knowledge to get around these radical problems, that we can use astrology, these knowledge of cycles and how it sets you up psychologically and emotionally to deal with this, because it's not a great situation. My greatest hope is that we can flourish instead of fighting each other, and create things and have more of a renaissance, rather than we have a kind of a void or a vacuum now, and various movements from the manosphere and the red pill have come in and played their role, or Bronze Age pervert, for example, have come in and played their role in this void, but nothing is quite stuck yet. Their efforts will endure, and there'll be stepping stones on the pathway, but the next step that we need to take hasn't really been laid yet. And I feel like what I'm trying to do here, and in collaboration with some of the other people you may know about, maybe that's how you came to know me, that we can pave the next stone and dance our way into a better situation, a better state of affairs. So that's what I've got for you today, guys. Thank you so much for listening. If you have any questions about this, you can find me on Paul Publisher, at Paul Publisher on Twitter. That's where I'll post some of the supplementary info I mentioned here, as well as in the video description. Thank you, guys, and have a great day.